So when Cleveland was running the next time, he was still running as a man who was the symbol of honesty in government. And I don't think Donald Trump can do that. So that's not going to be at all analogous. In that sense, they were quite opposite. I think if there's another lesson to be learned, it's that Cleveland adapted the presidency. He wasn't the same person the second time around. So he wasn't going to be the same president the second time around. I think Donald Trump is promising to be the same type of president the next time around, but maybe just more punitive of the people he doesn't like. Besides the fact that the country was entering into a depression, was how the two candidates treated each other. Harrison had defeated Cleveland. At the inauguration for Harrison, Cleveland holds up an umbrella over his head, a gesture so unique to the times and perhaps to those personalities. It's hard to imagine today a defeated incumbent doing that, but Cleveland did.
The only U.S. president who has succeeded in this endeavor, that is, serving 2 non-consecutive terms, is Grover Cleveland, who was our 22nd and then 24th president. So let's get into it. Tell us a bit about Cleveland's background. Who was he before his presidency?
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. In terms of Grover Cleveland, he was a New Yorker, just like Mr. Trump and just like several other presidents had come from New York. But he had a different kind of background than several other New Yorkers that had become president. Cleveland had no sort of elitism as part of his background. He began his life as a sheriff, but that, in a sense, kind of signaled some of the path he was going to follow, because Cleveland ended up devoting his life to fighting corruption. And after serving as a sheriff and then a mayor, he eventually became governor of New York. All of these things, all positions in which he sort of fought corruption. And it was from his position as governor that he first ran for president, and he won a plurality of the vote. He actually won at least the plurality of the vote each of the 3 times he ran. And that was a focus of his presidency, certainly in his first term. His second term, which came later, had a different focus.
So his first term was fighting corruption and crime. That was like the big theme of his first term, right?
Corruption in government, and at the same time, trying to ensure that the government's budget was balanced, and that he didn't try as much in his first term to keep Congress in line, but he did try to sort of, I think, stand for the integrity of the office. There were issues that came up later, and then I'm sure we'll talk about.
So yeah, let's talk about that. In 1888, Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, is running for a second term against Benjamin Harrison, the Republican. What happens here?
Well, it's an unusual race.
Unusual, okay.
Unusual in the sense that you had really 2 presidents running against each other. You had an incumbent president, Benjamin Harrison, running against a former president. We've never really had that kind of circumstance before. And at the same time, they had very sharp differences. But one of the things that really stands out for me in the election, besides the fact that the country was entering into a depression, was how the 2 candidates treated each other. Harrison had defeated Cleveland. At the inauguration for Harrison, Cleveland holds up an umbrella over his head.
Wait, he holds an umbrella over the head who had defeated him.
Yes, it was raining, but it was a gesture so unique to the times and perhaps to those personalities. It's hard to imagine today a defeated incumbent doing that, but Cleveland did. And then
That's an understatement, Professor Gerhardt.
and then when they ran against each other the second time, unfortunately, Harrison's wife died during the campaign, and Cleveland stopped campaigning out of respect for Harrison.
Wow.
And again, that's hard for us to imagine. And he didn't really sort of come back without at least getting a signal from Harrison that the campaign should continue. And so those moments for me are real rarities, especially in contrast to the kind of animosity and that we see these days, and the lack of sort of empathy and some of the class we see in people running for the presidency.
That's for sure. You said unique to the times. Were the 1880s not as polarized as our time now? Especially 1880s was less than 20 years after the Civil War, right?
Well, I think the times were polarized. You'd have to search pretty hard to find times in America when things were not polarized.
Yeah.
But I think they didn't necessarily transmit into the candidates being nasty or the candidates sort of not respecting the office that they were running for.
That's huge. What was the 1888 election like? Were there any sort of rumors of fraud or anything like that?
Well, there were some rumors of fraud, but they didn't really relate to the election itself. So I think one of the big issues that came up in 1888 was the fact the economy was really tanking, and the country was about to, in fact, enter into a depression, and so much of the campaign was focused on the economy, and less so on the integrity of either of the candidates. Personality-wise, they were quite different. Harrison was extremely reserved. Cleveland was not necessarily gregarious, but he was certainly more gregarious than Harrison. And they differed personality-wise, but they really differed in the extent to which they thought the government had a role in trying to deal with economic trouble.
I see. How did Cleveland orchestrate his comeback after 4 years? Now he's running against an incumbent, someone in the White House.
So Cleveland did not go away after his defeat. He did not sort of, in a sense, after his defeat, go off and become something else. In other words, an ex-president. He remained central to the Democratic Party, tried to maintain leadership within the party, and I think he had every intention of returning, or at least fighting to return. In fact, one of the things his wife had said on leaving, and I'm just paraphrasing, was something like, don't get rid of the furniture, we're going to be back. That's kind of a
that's great.
But that gives you an idea of his mindset, that he was not going to give up on politics or necessarily or choose not to run again. So he was always positioning himself from the moment he lost to becoming the Democratic candidate again and running against Harrison. And so that was his posture throughout those 4 years.
Was the Democratic Party behind him, or did he have to jockey to get into that front position?
Largely behind him. It was not necessarily unified completely, but as a former president who had actually won the nomination the first time and actually won the presidency the first time, Cleveland was a formidable figure within the party, and nobody was going to beat him, and nobody did.
Contest that. Now, we already established that he handled his loss with dignity, the incident of the umbrella. First, he went to the inauguration. Let's start with that. Then he holds the umbrella while while Harrison was reading his inaugural speech. He holds the umbrella over him in the rain. How did he remain relevant? You said, from the outset, he was positioning himself to run again and be the nominee.
Well, he stayed at the head of the party. That was one of the critical things. I mean, Cleveland appreciated that the president was also really the leader of the party, or the opposition party. And so Cleveland made sure that he kept that position. And that almost guaranteed he'd be the candidate next time around. So controlling the party, making sure that the other leaders within the party were going to support him and he was going to support them was crucial for his remaining a viable candidate for the presidency.
And I suppose that includes appearances, giving speeches, and all,
and being involved in other elections. Yeah.
Yeah. Now back to, obviously we didn't have social media, maybe, thank God, but were there newspapers that were, partisan,
that were largely sort of attached to one party or the other? And,
yeah.
And of course, Cleveland kept his hand there. He sort of made sure that the Democratic papers were sort of going to be supportive, or at least not critical. And so a lot of his activity during the 4 years when he wasn't president was spent on making sure that all this sort of Democratic apparatus, all that Democratic machinery, was something he could control and was going to be helpful to him in regaining office. And he was largely successful.
Yeah. Did he also submit op-eds, write articles, all that? I'm trying to figure out, how did he reach to the population in general?
More in terms of speeches, and even appearances. It's sort of keeping himself and really emerging as a critic of the incumbent President Harrison. Those things kept Cleveland in the news. And some former presidents, certainly in the 19th century, did not go away. Even when they weren't running again, they remained sort of as critics of the people that defeated them. And Cleveland, therefore, was very prominent as a critic of the policies of the Harrison administration. And that also positioned him as the primary opponent for Harrison.
I see. Are there any lessons from Cleveland's comeback for a potential Mr. Trump comeback in 2024?
Well, there probably are. I'm not sure I know all the lessons, but I think that, they were very different people, to be candid about it. Grover Cleveland had not necessarily led a scandal-free life before becoming president, but he acknowledged the so-called errors of his way. He actually had a child out of wedlock, but he acknowledged that. And one reason why he beat James Blaine in Cleveland's first run for the presidency is because Blaine, although he'd been in power for a long time, was subject to a lot of criticism for his handling of finances and his ethics while he was in office. So Cleveland, in running the first time, really was running on the ground that, look, I'm going to be honest with you about myself, and I will be honest in the office. Blaine lost in part because of the corruption, I think, that he had benefited from when he was a candidate. So when Cleveland was running the next time, he was still running as a man who was the symbol of honesty in government. And I don't think Donald Trump can do that. So that's not going to be at all analogous. In that sense, they were quite opposite. I think if there's another lesson to be learned, it's that Cleveland adapted the presidency. He wasn't the same person the second time around. So he wasn't going to be the same president the second time around. I think Donald Trump is promising to be the same type of president the next time around, but maybe just more punitive of the people he doesn't like.
Cleveland adapted positively.
Well, he adapted in the use of power. So he wasn't campaigning the second time to get even with the people that defeated him the first time. He wasn't campaigning the second time sort of to punish people. What he did promise and what he actually did in his second term was govern differently. And that was itself significant. So in his first term, Cleveland was a very passive figure in the sense that he let Congress do whatever it was going to do, and then he would veto things if he felt they were unconstitutional or against sort of or just really passed for bad reasons. However, in the second term, Cleveland got involved in the legislative process, tried to push legislation through, became much more sort of combative and much more assertive in trying to steer the legislative process, something he hadn't done in his first term.
Yeah.
So he was a very different kind of president in that second term. In fact, so different that Woodrow Wilson, at the time, a political scientist, said that Cleveland really was creating what we think of as the modern presidency.
Interesting. We'll be back after a short break to talk about another U.S. president who had a major comeback, Andrew Jackson. We'll be back.